explains that essentially, often the people, like the suppliers, pretend like they're acting in the public interest, where it's really benefiting themselves, and the reason that there isn't public political pressure against licensure is because, you know, it's on an individual basis, it's not as significant.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good outline. We're going to go through the individual points that you made, Eric, in more detail. So the first thing he says is that, you know, if you reduce the quantity of workers in an area, that benefits the people who are already in that area, but it harms the people who are interested in entering and the people who are interested in consuming that product. And this provides an incentive for groups to organize in order to license their profession to keep people out, but also a potential harm to the public from it. Now, he argues that one clear sign of this is that it has to do with who actually lobbies in favor of these restrictions on entry into the profession. And Edward, what does he say about that? And how is it relevant?
Technically, I mean, in theory, like it would be best if, like, you know, the consumer were to lobby.
Yeah.
But that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that he says that if these were really serving consumers' interests, which is the claim, then you would expect it to be consumer groups that are lobbying in favor of regulation. But in fact, it's usually the American Medical Association that cares the most about this and focuses most on it. A third point that he makes is that, you know, if the standard story were true, if this were really about serving the interests of consumers, you would expect that requirements to get into the profession were all extremely relevant to the quality of the services that the professional would provide. But Scott Mendelson? Scott Mendelson here? No? Well, but what he says is that, in fact, we see that many of the requirements to get into these professions are actually pretty darn irrelevant to your actual quality as a doctor. For example, he says that in some of these professions there are requirements that you certify not to being a communist. And he says that, you know, as much as he hates communism as much as anybody else does, it's not very relevant to whether you should be allowed to be a doctor or not. And that often what these professions do is they hijack other ethical views that people have in order to try to justify the policies that are protective of them, even when those aren't actually relevant to the qualifications. Another thing that he says, is Yike Wang here? Or Yike, or no? Is, as Eric was mentioning, that, you know, producers' interests are much more concentrated. Someone spends their whole life being a doctor, and a change in regulation therefore makes a huge difference to them. Whereas for any individual consumer, it makes a limited difference. And this creates a collective action problem that gives consumers much less incentive to reduce abuse than doctors do to exploit the system. And yeah.
But that would also make lobbying much easier for producers. So the fact that you don't see consumers lobbying doesn't really mean anything.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting potential argument. I mean, I think that he thinks that it's more than proportional. So I think he would say that, you know, you essentially see almost no consumers caring at all about this sort of stuff when you do see that in, like, consumer protection regulation for, like, product safety, for example. Whereas here you say much, much less than that in terms of, you know, supporting scope of practice regulations. So I think even relative to what you would expect in other areas where consumer interests are diffuse, you see very little consumer interest in supporting these types of regulations. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, what's your name?
Easy Dunyas.
Sorry?
Easy Dunyas.
Easy Dunyas. Okay.
But what about, say, the guild system in Europe?
Yeah.
I think that what you're leaving out here is culture itself, because there are different ways of how you arrange society.
Well, I think that there are different traditions, but that doesn't necessarily mean the traditions serve the interest of society as a whole, or of the... I mean, I think a lot of people are very critical of the guild system. And I would be pretty critical of the guild system, especially as historically implemented in, like, say, 18th, 19th century Europe. So I do think that's a long-term historical institution, but I don't think that means it's beneficial necessarily. Yeah, sorry, what's your name?
David.
David.
I'm not currently registered.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
But so, if according to his logic, like the doctors are trying to fleece the public, right?
Yeah.
In a sense. Is there any evidence like that's actually their reasoning, like that we have like an American Medical Association meeting, like, or something that says, you know?
Well, this is what I was about to say. So what often happens with these professions is that they don't say that, but they create ideologies that are very convenient for them to believe in if that's their interest. So for example, they create a view that the most important thing is that everyone get the absolute highest quality health care. And they can come to believe that really that's what matters. Economic trade-offs don't matter. What matters is the absolute highest quality health care. Now if you come to have an ideology like that, well then maybe you can justify excluding people who you view as not as high quality from the market, right? So I think that often, the biggest lies are the ones we tell ourselves, right? To justify the way in which we live. Actually, I'm going to go on a huge, huge digression and just tell you a story that's related to this. There's a passage from Tolstoy from A Resurrection. Has anyone ever read the book A Resurrection by Tolstoy? One person. Yeah, it's one of his least well-known novels, and it's actually not one of his best, but there's this great passage where there's a prostitute. And this prostitute has this paradigm, this ideology, this sort of like worldview, under which sex is the most important thing in the world. Everything else is really just a way of disguising people's ultimate interest in sex. Does this sound reminiscent of Freud? Yes, absolutely. But this was actually written 20 years before Freud became prominent. So I don't think it was directly related to that. But anyways, so she has this whole ideology about how sex is really the center of the world. And he says, why does she have this ideology? Well, it's because under that view of the world, she may be a lowly prostitute on the streets of Moscow. But under that view, actually, she's the most powerful person in the world. And everything else is really dressing up to disguise the fact that she's the most powerful person in the world, right? And then he says, well, and you go to a prison and you find that the thief, who you'd think would be embarrassed that he's a thief, is incredibly proud of how dexterous he is at, pecking various locks, right? And you talk to the murderer, and he's incredibly proud of the fact that he, can kill people and it doesn't even affect him, right? And you think this is so terrible until you meet a general. And you realize that this general has killed many more people than the murderer has ever killed and is proud of what he's accomplished. And that the politician is proud of all the power that he has over other people and never thinks about the consequences that it has for people's lives. Or the rich man who knows exactly how he got rich, right? And what you realize is that all of us need to tell ourselves a story that makes us very important people in the world, and that we really can't live in the absence of that. So what does that have to do with economics? Well, I won't bore you with that. But anyways, it's a story about how we create ideologies in our mind that justify sort of the position that we serve within society. Anyways, okay. So what does Friedman advocate as a solution to this problem? Is Sarojini here? Sarojini Rao? That's you. How do I pronounce your name?
Call me Jeannie.
Jeannie?
Yeah.
Okay. So what does Friedman advocate as an alternative?
Probably for all doctors who are qualified to be able to practice, or at least be able to supply their medical services, perhaps with certification.
Yeah, that's right. He favors certification, or he sort of hesitantly favors certification. Right. Why does he hesitantly favor certification rather than just allowing?
Because the same kind of ideological thing can come in with who gets certified as well. So people could be sort of blacklisted as bad doctors without actually, on very flimsy grounds.
Yeah. So
He
thinks it's better to have certification than to just allow, have no process of screening doctors, because he's afraid that the information would not really be supplied by a free market very efficiently, because once you know that a doctor is certified, that information gets out, and it's really hard for anyone to charge for that information, right? And so for the same reasons we have intellectual property for things, he supports having government supply of certification, but he thinks that the certification, as Ginny was saying, could get really bad if it got corrupted by producers' interests, right? And therefore having the discipline that you have the doctors who are uncertified who you can always go to keeps the certification system honest, as well as expanding consumers' choices. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So what exactly is the difference between certification and the licensing that you were mentioning before? I didn't...
Oh, the key difference is that the certification doesn't prevent people who are uncertified from practicing legally. It just says that we're going to go and we're going to stamp some doctors as good and stamp others as bad, or not stamp others at all, but you can always have the right to go to the unstamped ones, even though they're potentially bad. Yeah.
So is
Yeah.
the suggestion that you can have certification by different bodies?
Well, I think he's sympathetic actually to having government certification.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your second point is that doctors that are not certified can be involved in certification, or
No. The second point is that the fact that certification is does not keep people, lack of certification doesn't keep people out of the industry, keeps the certification honest, because they have to worry that consumers will all defect to the non-certified doctors if the system gets too corrupt.
So it just
Yeah,
puts a
Andre.
limit on the markup? The doctor can charge?
Well, I mean, roughly, yeah. It puts a limit on the distortion, yeah.
What
Yeah,
actually
Ginny.
currently, under the licensing practice,
Yeah.
prevent consumers from going to unlicensed doctors?
The person will go to jail if they
Is
use.
it cost?
Yeah, you can go to jail if you try to practice doctor's services in some way.
Well, then I
Yeah,
thought
Chrissy.
that was the argument in the paper about chiropractors and, people who don't practice medicine. I thought that was, those were the unlicensed doctors, basically. Or you get somebody with like a nurse practitioner.
Yeah, but I think there's scopes of practice things that those guys aren't allowed to do. So, like for example, I wasn't going to. Here's another. I'm going to tell the story in a second. I'll tell you a story about this in a second. Eric, what do you think are some things about like the medical system today that are like explained by or related to what Friedman is saying in his article?
I mean, just like in general.
Yeah, whatever.
So obviously, like the whole like very long and med school process, right? The fact that it's very difficult to become a doctor. You have to go through undergrad, you have to take certain classes,
Yeah.
and you have to go through med school, and you have to do a residency, and basically it's just like it's almost like a hazing process.
Yeah.
To like restrict entry.
Yeah.
And on top of that, like a lot of the practices that doctors use are highly influenced by their peers, and seem a lot like they choose to do specific, treatments based on the fact that like everyone else is doing it because like I don't have to worry about medical malpractice.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to worry about losing my licensure.
Yeah.
And that skews their behavior in that respect.
Yeah, those are both really interesting points. I mean, I think the broadest point is just the medical system is incredibly costly. If you think about most other sectors of the economy, like consumer electronics or delivery of household goods, these things have gotten like enormously more efficient over time, right? I mean, it's like almost unimaginable how much more efficient they are today than they were 30 years ago. Whereas medicine has hardly improved at all. I mean, like literal technological advances in drug treatments have advanced, but in terms of the delivery of medicine, it's probably gotten less efficient over the last 30 or 50 years. Licensure is not the only reason, but it's probably part of the reason. Yeah, go ahead.
Couldn't you just explain that with the standard hairdresser's explanation?
Which is that you need to physically be there to do the service, and therefore.
Certain kinds of